What? Passive verbs? I have to learn more verb endings. Are you joking? This is what I hear every single year when I introduce passive verbs to my GCSE classes. But after about 2 lessons, they actually like them more than active verbs. In this video, I'm going to give you a rundown of how passive verbs in all 6 tenses are formed and how to translate them. Now, to help with this, I strongly suggest you go and download this free PDF guide to all Latin verb endings. It has all active and passive endings, so it'll be really useful as you start getting familiar with passive verbs. If you want a complete explanation of any of the tenses I go over in this video, subscribe to my channel for updates when I upload more in-depth videos on each tense, because this is just a wrap-up of all of them in one go. So active or passive? Well, passive verbs are actually really easy to spot and translate once you get your head around them. In active sentences, the nominative is the person in charge of the action, and the accusative is the thing receiving the action. So, for example, the boy kicked the horse. The boy is the nominative, he kicked the horse in the accusative. However, in a passive sentence, the nominative is not doing the action. They're a passive participant in the action. It's being done to them. So, the boy was kicked by the horse. The nominative is still the subject of the sentence, but his role has changed. So the boy is my subject, he's my nominative in both sentences, but in the first one he is kicking the horse, and in the second one he is being kicked. That's a passive. In Latin, passives are quite easy to spot. They look a bit like active verbs, but with clear and key differences. For example, the present tense, passive, uses the present stem, the first principal part, and then adds on passive endings. They're very unique. So for I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they, you use are, ris, ter, mer, mini, and ter. That second person plural is very different to the active, but that helpfully makes it very recognizable. For porto, portare, which means to carry, this gives me these forms of the verb. Portor, portares, portator, portamo, portamini, portanto. You can translate these as I am being carried, you are being carried, and so on. But you could also just say I am carried. I find it easier to show people the being, I am being carried, at the beginning, just because it helps you keep in mind that it is passive, it's being done to you. Someone else is doing the carrying, I'm the subject of the sentence still. I am being carried. Now these endings also form the basis for the imperfect passive and the future passive endings. They're formed from the present stem, they use the same passive endings, but they just have slightly additional things in the middle. They follow the pattern of the imperfect and future tenses in the active, so hopefully that should give you a good clue. Imperfect passives have the classic BA syllable added to the present stem. So you have your present stem, your BA, and then the passive endings are tacked onto the end. So, for example, we have bar, baris, bartor, barmo, barmini, banter. So it's the same as the present passive endings, but with that BA syllable in the middle. So, for example, porta bar, porta baris, porta batur, porta barmo, porta barmini, and porta banter. And they mean I was being carried, you were being carried, he, she was being carried, and so on. The future passives for the first and second conjugation again start with the present stem. Then you add the bo or bis or bit that you get from the future active verbs, and then you add the passive endings onto that. So it has the bo syllable for the first person, porta bo, but then it changes, porta beris. Luckily, the rest have the bi and the bu from the future active tense, so porta bitter, porta bimmer, porta bimini, and porta bunto. These are I will be carried, you will be carried, he, she, it will be carried. So again, we've got that passive sense. I am the subject for I will be carried, but someone else is doing the carrying. However, remember, this is just the first and second conjugation. There are 2 forms of the future, just like there are in the active. Instead, we have are, eris, etter, emmer, emini, enter. Now this might seem confusing because it seems like the present tense. However, the thematic vowel has changed. Traho in the present active is traho, trahis, trahit, and in the present passive is trahor, traheris, trahita. So the one you need to watch out for is that second person singular, you will be dragged, traheris, because it's the same as the present passive. However, all the others use an E rather than an I like you find in the present passive, so the future rule still stands. First and second, future be, third and fourth, always E. Now for the perfect passive. For this one, you take the fourth principal part, which is called the perfect passive participle. Then you add on the verb to be in the present tense. Now, an important thing to know, because I've written us, at, some, and who knows what that means? Well, potatus, potata, potatum, which is the perfect passive participle, acts like an adjective here. So you have to use the nominative singular endings for I, you, he, she, it. So that's my us, at, it with the slashes that I've got in the first three. And then for my plurals, I've got e, I, a, e, I, a, e, I, a. They are my plurals for we, you plural, and they. I have to use those because it has to match my nominative. You only have to use the nominative case endings, but it changes based on the gender of the nominative. So for a masculine, you'd use portatus, for a feminine, portata, and for a neuter, portatum. Then you figure out who's doing it with the version of esse that is being used. It's being attached to the end of the participle. So sum est, sumus estis sunt. Now this is in the present tense, even though it's a perfect passive, because what we're using is the perfect passive participle. So that's how I know what tense it is. So my version of the verb to be tells me who is doing it, and the participle that's in front of the verb to be tells me what kind of person is doing it, whether it's one or more, or masculine, feminine, or neuter. I have been carried, or I was carried. You have been carried, or you were carried. He, she, it has been carried, or he, she, it was carried. Whichever you feel helps you to show the passive best. One thing I will say is that if I was doing it for me, I identify as female, so I use portata. Then I would add sum. So portata sum would be I have been carried. If the table has been carried, then I would use portatum est, a third person singular neuter ending. If I'm talking about we, I would use portati sumus, we have been carried, because it's plural and it's a combination of masculine and feminine. Now this is the same for the pluperfect passives. You use the fourth principal part in agreement with the subject and then add the verb to be, this time in the imperfect tense. So if I had been carried, I would use eram, portatus eram. I would use portata eram because I identify as female. But if you wanted to say you plural had been carried, you would use portati eratis, unless it was a group of women, in which case portatai with an ae on the end, eratis. Again, it's the same for the future perfect passive. The fourth principal part with the verb to be in the future this time. So portatus ero, portatus eris, portatus erit, portati erimus, portati eritis, portati erunt. And you change the nominative based on who is the subject of your sentence. So if it is the dogs, then you'd probably use portati, unless they're, tables, in which case you might use portata, erunt for neuter. So that's an overview of passive verbs in every tense. If you want a more in-depth account of a particular tense in the passive, along with exercises and examples, subscribe to my channel to be notified when these upcoming videos have been uploaded. Don't forget to grab that super useful guide to all Latin verbs. It will really help with recognising the tenses and endings and looking up endings for exercises. I hope you have found this video enjoyable and most of all helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on bambasbat.